Hello, welcome to ihomeschoolph, where we'll talk about what really matters most in our homeschooling journey. Magandang araw po sa kanilang lahat at maraming salamat po at pinili niyo pong makinig sa amin ngayong araw na to. Bakit ko sinabing sa amin? Before that, I would just like to say na ngayon pong Agosto, buwan ng Tagalog, buwan ng Filipino. Kaya excited po ako. Naku, pipilitin ko pong magsalita ng purong Tagalog. But, ito na nga sasabihin ko, I cannot promise. But I just want this discussion with a friend that I hope I could have a long-term relationship with this friend. Dahil later, I'm gonna introduce to her to you. But alam niyo po, to just do the premise of this topic. I know that we have been exploring the topic about teaching Filipino. And whether ba na talaga bang mahirap ituro ito. And I know, teaching any language naman will present their own set of difficulties. But when it comes to teaching Filipino, there are very unique aspects to consider. From all those complexities of grammar, pronunciation, culture, di ba? Teaching Filipino requires really a thoughtful approach. Like ako, I just want to be honest. Yan po ang pinakamahirap ko talagang tinuro sa mga anak ko. And I have to be honest. And even when I was in college, nahirapan talaga ako. I think yan po ang yeah, I have to be honest. Yan po ang pinakamababa kong grade nung ako po ay nag-aaral, nung estudyante pa lang. Whether I was in my elementary years, high school, and even in college. O yan ha, honest na ako. But for today's podcast, let us explore, and let us delve on how to be able to teach this beautiful language and explore strategies to make learning process more accessible and enjoyable for both us as educators, homeschoolers, and learners alike. That's why I invited a dear, a dear homeschooler as well, yeah. Na based po siya sa Iloilo, a homeschool mom, writer, entrepreneur, and a Charlotte Mason coach. I think she has her own website. Later, she's going to tell us about this. Advocate po siya ng Charlotte Mason and trainer din po siya. And nakakatuwa po dahil pareho kami, we love reading, storytelling, and creating just about anything. Definitely, love na love niya ang kitchen, and she does a lot of articles, different songs, curriculum, and nako, magaling siyang mag-crochet pieces. Baka magpaturo pa nga ako sa kanya. So, let us welcome Yen Cabag. Hello, Yen!
Hi, Miss Nove. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction.
Yun ha, sinabi ko na yan. Baka hopefully we can have a long-term relationship. Hindi lang sa interviewing ito, di ba?
Yes.
Alam mo, nakakatawa kasi pinag-pray ko talaga tong conversation na to. And you were a good friend of mine told me na itong girl na to, hanapin mo tong girl na to. And then I really prayed about it. And then when I message you, sabi ko, Lord, pag hindi po siya sumagot, yun na po yun. Pero sumagot ka and it's really an answered prayer. And then, my dear friend, si Katso po yung nag-recommend na may nakita ako mga materials, that you were giving to our homeschooler in your own website, At yung mga Filipino materials na talagang magaganda na I was able to check out. And that's why I think you're one of the best homeschooler or homeschool teacher that I can talk to you about this. Okay, bakit nga ba, Yen, na ang mga magulang hirap na hirap magturo ng Pilipino, So, before that, maybe you could be able to briefly introduce yourself and your experience in teaching Filipino to your kids.
Sige. So, firstly, you already gave the first background. I'm not from the Manila area. So, I'm from Iloilo, which means that our first language is not Filipino or Tagalog. Our first language is Hiligaynon. So, in our family, we raised up our kids speaking our native language. We didn't raise them up to speak English at first. So parang naging second language yung English, and then yung Filipino actually, like it or not, naging third language siya kasi the schools here and everything else, primary mode of instruction and everything is actually in English. So yung Filipino, it started off as actually a separate subject, but we treated this more as a foreign language for us. which doesn't mean, I don't mean that in a degrading sense, na foreign siya kahit we're in the Philippines, but it's just foreign to us because we don't speak it here. Here in Iloilo, we only speak Hiligaynon, and yung exposure to Filipino is mostly, well, TV, radio, and thankfully, recent years we have storybooks na in Filipino for the younger years. Kasi when we were growing up, if you recall, Miss Nove, kahit when we were growing up, parang mahirap talaga maghanap ng storybooks in Filipino, right? All our storybooks were in English, all our nursery rhymes were in English, except for yung mga tinuturo sa school. So that's one important background I think that I want to share, and I believe that it's also a struggle for a lot of homeschooling moms because a lot of us are not really from regions that speak Filipino as a first language.
Yes, totoo yan, Yen. So, sa palagay mo, Yen, no? In your opinion, is the Filipino language generally considered difficult to teach? Why? And why not?
Personally, I think it has to do with how the parents themselves view the Filipino language. A lot of us grew up having difficulty in the Filipino subject, perhaps, like I said earlier, because we don't speak the language, and also perhaps because in school we were made to memorize grammar terms and other stuff without first having had a strong grasp of the language. In my personal experience kasi, I learned Filipino mostly, not actually from school. I first learned it because every summer, my family would go to Manila and we would spend time with my cousins there. So parang immersion siya. And I remember even complaining, dati I would complain to my mom, why do I have to learn to speak Filipino? Why can't my cousins learn to speak Hiligaynon? And it was very difficult for a child to understand. But looking back, I'm so glad that I had that experience. I was able to immerse myself in the language. I can't say I perfected it, but parang naging conversational siya, naging part siya of one of the many languages that I've learned. That's for my personal experience, and I feel like it's also something that can be helpful for parents as we try to teach our children Filipino as well. So when we view it as a language that we want to learn, that we love, it will really impact the way that our children view the language as well.
Okay, do you think, okay, thank you for sharing that background kasi parang pareho din tayo ng wavelength at then. But are there any specific features of that Filipino language that make it more challenging to teach? How about the materials that we have now that is available to us?
Are you referring to textbooks or?
Maybe textbook or what we have right now, yeah.
Yes, actually, I think one of the difficulties, like I mentioned, is because when we were made to like memorize things before we become familiar with the language. Yes, kasi the way that the textbooks are currently structured, it seems to assume that everyone already understands the language. Like even for grade 1 to 3, right? You would see all these paragraphs the children are asked to like analyze to pieces. I think that has their place if it's somebody who already knows the language. But if it's somebody where the language is totally foreign, I can't imagine how we'll be able to do those kinds of things. So that's why I believe that one of the most important things is that the child actually learns to understand it muna, like listening to it, being able to understand it, being able to speak it, and then by then we'll be able to use these materials that help us to analyze the different parts in the passages.
Yes, thank you so much, Yen. Disclaimer lang po rito, baka sabihin, ako, ang mahirap talagang gamitin ng mga DepEd materials or textbook. Wala po kami sinasabing ganun dito sa podcast na to, no? Or sa iHomeschoolph podcast. But, DepEd knows me in a way, but this is a point of view na pwede rin ma-improve yung materials natin that we have, isn't it? That could be able to really match definitely our learners. And I know it's improving naman, no, by the grace of God. But, let's talk about our own experiences yan, di ba? So, how do you approach teaching Filipino to your kids? Meron ka bang strategies and techniques on how, siyempre, no, nagsa-start ka palang mag-homeschooling, di ba? You have that mission na talagang kailangan nating ituro yan. So, how do you do it?
Yes, I think coming from the background where we adhere to the Charlotte Mason philosophy, in the Charlotte Mason philosophy kasi, we use a lot of living books. When you say living books, it's books that are written by somebody who's passionate about the subject and it awakens the imagination. So we do that for English books. And as I said earlier, English is actually already our second language. And I noticed that the way that my child learned English it actually began with these picture books. Kasi we didn't, I mentioned earlier, we did not raise our children to speak English first. We spoke Hiligaynon in the home. And when my son was 5 years old and we started homeschooling, we were starting to read all these long books in English. And I realized in the first 2 months in that hindi talaga niya maintindihan. So I had to stop. I actually wanted to give up homeschooling during that time because I was like, how can we do this? You can't even understand these basic books that we're using. Good thing was during that time I went into an online forum and they helped me diagnose that actually English is our second language. So it was not fair to expect him to understand those paragraphs without contextual clues, without pictures and all that. So some of the moms advised me to go back to picture books, which we did for a time, because during that time I wasn't intentional at reading picture books with my first son. So we went back to picture books, and slowly I saw that it was building up his vocabulary, it was building up his comprehension of the English language, and eventually was able to progress to chapter books. So I saw that the way he learned English was actually possible to help him learn Filipino. Like I said, we don't have any exposure to Filipino unless you watch TV, which during that time we actually didn't, and we don't really let our kids watch a lot of TV. So they don't have exposure to the Filipino language like I did with my cousins. So what we did, we invested in Filipino storybooks, and I'm so glad that we have a lot on our shelves right now. Things by OMF, Tahanan Books, Hias, and all that stuff. So we started with these picture books, and I would just read them to him. And slowly it would build up his vocabulary. For some reason, it would surprise you that just reading picture books can help children understand what's going on. They can pick up words, familiar words here and there. Some of the words in Hiligaynon are the same in Filipino. So it just sticks with them, and they start to ask things. And slowly, the key word is slowly. It didn't happen overnight. It happened over years of going through these books and helping them to just be exposed to the Filipino language.
Okay, thank you so much, Yen. Thank you, no? Ang maganda talaga yun eh, no? Yun yung non-intimidating material na pwedeng start ng isang magulang. Kung talagang hindi, start with the picture books. I mean, ako, I do it's, I have some friends, I still remember before, na nasa level na sila ng grade 4, pero Novi talaga hindi ako marunong magturo. Then start with picture books, no? Hindi naman siya parang, kailangan mong pilitan na kailangan yung grade 4 level na talagang kailangan mo ituro. You have to do it slowly kasi kailangan ma-absorb nila eh. Immersion is really, really important. One of the things that I also realized is maybe you could be able to have a family meeting and maybe kausapin niyo kung meron kayong helper or kayong mag-asawa, merong isa na makipag-usap ng purong Tagalog at merong isa na purong English. Pwede rin yun, no? Especially kung medyo maliliit pa yung mga bata, di ba, Yen? It's like speaking one thought completely and using one language. I think that will work as well. That I did that as well. Or you could be able to do maybe, as in my experience, buti nga ngayon may Spotify na, Yen. Dati walang Spotify, so kumukuha pa ako ng mga CD-CD na na pwede nilang pakinggan araw-araw, na pwede nilang kantahin din.
Yes.
Like yung mga Christmas songs, yung mga artist na talagang nag-aano ng mga Filipino spirit, no? Na Filipino all the way. And I still remember when we were starting, I did mind mapping in Filipino. So, kung gagamitin mo yung mga bagay sa loob ng bahay, naglalagay ako ng mga labels yon. Pero I also do mind mapping. I'm not sure about, if you did mind mapping. Mind mapping is like a concept map siya, na cognitive cartography. So parang it reinforces that idea that whatever we are mapping into two-dimensional way, merong depth siya, may benefits, parang visual picture siya, para mas matandaan ng bata. So, mga magulang, thank you for sharing yan ha. Madaming ways for you to be able to really teach Filipino na hindi ka masyadong stress na kailangan ko using isang material lang to teach, because there's a lot of ways teaching Filipino language without losing your mind. Di ba, Yen?
Yes.
So,
It can be fun.
Teach it? Yeah. Kasi napansin ko meron kang meron kang medyong mas matandang anak. So how do you teach that to your child, Filipino language na medyo matanda na?
So for the older kids, once I know that they have a strong grasp na of the language, like for my older son, he is now in high school, I let him use one of the materials that I actually created, which is a Sariling Atin, Filipino Grammar Curriculum. It's just a very simplified, not really very simplified, it's a 36-week lesson of the basic parts of speech, where we use different passages in literature and then they try to identify which part of speech these are. Yeah, so we actually only did it this past year. I'm glad to see na parang, yeah, he did it well naman. Since he's older, he was more independent na doing it on his own. But I was also able to see na one of the books that we assigned to him for last year, he was able to read through all by himself na. So I know na he probably did not understand every word, but that's perfectly fine. Yes, because we understand things through context naman. Yeah, but I think it's already a big success that he was able to really understand the main thrust of the story, what was happening and all that. I think that's my personal goal din sa kanila, that they'll be able to communicate in the language. At least they can understand, they can read, they can speak a little bit enough to get by.
Yeah. Totoo yan na. Thank you for being honest with that journey as well. Kasi, some of the parents will always be in parang nagigilty sila na parang, ano ba yun? Hindi talaga fluent yung anak ko. Hindi naman kailangan maging sobrang fluent eh. Hindi naman yun yung goal natin. Actually, it's the love of learning the language. Pag alam mo
Yes,
talaga na ang anak mo kasi I do believe, pag medyo older na sila, di ba, they will be able to find out and navigate that within themselves. We just have to give
yes,
them
yes.
the resources and the confidence to be able to, not to be afraid, na hindi ma-frustrate. Kasi, like ako, I realize, because I have that fear of teaching Filipino, pwede nila ma-acquire yun eh. So, I really have to deal it with God na, no, I do not have to be afraid. And I have to be honest with my kids na, anak, I want to learn with you as well. Diba? I have to learn with you as well, and I'm navigating this as well. So, let us learn together. So, kayong mga magulang na nakikinig sa amin ngayon ni Yen, so, how do you do that? Well, katulad nito, you can listen to a podcast. You can ask some mentors on how they do it as well. Do not be afraid. Do not think less of you na parang, uy, ang hirap namang ituro nito, di ba? Parang hindi ko ata kakayanin. And if talaga hindi mo talaga kaya, wala kang patience, you could also ask some of my friends what they did. They got a homeschooler din siya na parent, na parang nag-hybrid sila. Ayan, nagtutulungan sila na it's like a small community that they have a small class all about Filipino. Ayan, pwede rin yun. Or pwede rin one-on-one. So, madami namang ways, pero don't think of yourself as less of a mom teacher dahil ginawa mo yun or nag-ask ka ng help. Di ba, Yen? What is your take of this?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great idea. Parang co-op, no? Yeah, at least. And the advantage of working on it in groups is they get to see everyone else also learning the same thing alongside them. Yeah, so it's a big encouragement. And they actually, when you mentioned yung mga co-op, they actually have more opportunities to practice the language. Like, for example, when we were in traditional school, we would have things like plays, contests, yung mga ganyan. And it's difficult to do when it's just you in the home, right? But if it's in the group, nagiging masaya siya. Like, you can actually try to write plays, poems in Filipino. And I believe that it actually helps you to enjoy the language more when you explore it artistically.
Yes, definitely with others, no? Tulungan talaga tulungan. So, Yen, what gave you the motivation to be able to make these materials in Filipino?
Yes, I think it was also the same thing when you said na most moms are afraid to teach it, and parang we don't really have the resources to teach it by degrees in a way. Yeah, so I created Sariling Atin with the goal of helping the students transition to grammar as long as nandun na yung foundation. So that's why I designed it for grades 4 to 6 or older and not in the early years, because for the early years, I recommended, for example, in our Talino curriculum, curriculum, which is the overall curriculum for different grade levels, I recommended the different storybooks muna. Like they would have these series like O Mateo and all these different books from Adarna and all these different publishers, so that maano siya, talagang exposed sila to the language in a way na parang regular exposure. They get to improve their vocabulary through the stories, so that by the time they learn grammar, which is according to the Charlotte Mason philosophy, is only after you're aware, you're familiar with the language, only after you're familiar with sentence structure and everything, do you teach grammar. So that's why I created the material for the older children.
Yes, ano maganda rito sa sariling atin mga bahagi ng pananalita, ano? Tama, correct me if I'm wrong. Ito yung kauna-unahan na barilala ng Filipino, tama, ayon sa philosophy ng Charlotte Mason. So, yung mga nakikinig sa atin ngayon, ano, Yen and I are gonna discuss about Charlotte Mason in our next episode this coming September. So, abangan nyo po yan. But, can you tell us about, when you say Charlotte Mason, can you give us like hint about this? Why do you say that this book is in this philosophy?
The specific area of the Charlotte Mason philosophy that I used for Sariling Atin is the use of living books or excellently written material, which means na we don't talk down to the children. Hindi natin ginagawang parang oversimplified yung mga sentences and everything. Instead, we use yung mga literary works. So in Sariling Atin, we use passages from yung mga best pieces of literature. Supposedly, I intended to use yung mga Filipino stories talaga, but for currently, yung mga Filipino stories natin, because they're more recently published, hindi sila free of copyright. So I used yung